Well, welcome everybody to the latest edition of Star Cells and God. This is the podcast where we explore the frontiers of science and what new discoveries tell us about God's existence and the reliability of Scripture. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined in studio today by Jeff Zweerink, who's a Christian apologist and an astrophysicist. And we both work for an organization called Reasons to Believe, which is the organization that sponsors this podcast. So if you want to know more about Reasons to Believe, go to our website, www.reasons.org, or you can follow us on social media, RTB_official. And then last but not least, watch this program on our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1, and subscribe and set a reminder, click the bell, and that will give you a notification the next time a new episode of Star Cells and God drops. So welcome, and without any further ado, we're going to be getting into today's discoveries. Jeff, you've got a discovery for us on quantum entanglement. Is that right?
Yes, it is quantum entanglement, and it's a little less of a new discovery because these have been around for a while, but it's brought into light because there were three scientists who were recently awarded the Nobel Prize for their work in investigating what's going on with quantum mechanics. And just to kind of give a little bit of background, we have this universe that we go out and make measurements of. We got these laws of physics that determine how things behave. But starting in the early 1900s and progressing throughout up to the current day, we're increasingly recognize that we live in a quantum mechanical world, not a classical world. And there are just a lot of really bizarre things that flow out of that. And so, ultimately, or kind of what led to the discovery of the quantum mechanics was this recognition that as you heated things up, you expected them to get hotter and hotter and hotter, which they do. And you expected them to give off higher and higher wavelengths, which they do for a while until they don't. And this phenomena, as people began to investigate it, and there were other things that played into that, led to this realization that our world comes in quantized packets instead of being continuous all the way down to arbitrarily small scales. And this is, the founder, or the headwaters of developing quantum mechanics theory. And one of the interesting things about quantum mechanics, though, is that you can write down this thing called a wave function, and as you perform different operations on the wave function, you can make predictions of what kinds of results you're going to see from experiments. Incredibly accurate in terms of its predictions. But there are some kind of odd phenomena that play out. You come up with a new way of looking at things, and odd phenomena play out. With general relativity, that was a fundamental change in how we looked at the world. Instead of space and time being these static quantities that everything just operated in, general relativity said, when Einstein introduced general relativity, it said that no, lo and behold, space and time were these dynamic entities. And one of the ways that these dynamic entities worked were that if you concentrated enough mass, you could get a rupture in the fabric of space-time, and you get a black hole where even moving at the speed of light cannot escape. And so it's this weird phenomena that then people went out, and lo and behold, you can measure that there are these things called black holes in there. So with quantum mechanics, the interesting part that shows up is that this you can predict very accurately what the outcomes of an experiment will be statistically speaking, but on any given measurement, you don't know what you're going to get. And so people have been wrestling with this idea of, is quantum mechanics really, is our world really statistical in that there's this wave function, and the peculiar property of the wave function is that when it's describing things, so for example, talking about an electron can have a spin. It can either be spin up or spin down. Well, in the wave function, the way it's formulated, it's a superposition of those. And so you look at the mathematics, and the wave function says, all right, the electron is in this combination of spin up and spin down. Yet when we make measurements, we always measure either spin up or spin down. And so there's this big question of what happens in when you make a measurement. Is the wave function really what's real, and it collapses into this other, just one of the outcomes, or is the wave function just a mathematical tool that, it's really just unclear what reality looks like, is what it amounts to in there. And so as people were developing quantum mechanics, there were these interesting things that you could actually take things and entangle them quantum mechanically. Now you can spread them apart, move them apart to large distances, and by making a measurement on one, because they're entangled, I can make a measurement, and that tells me something apparently instantaneously about what's going on with the other one. And so you got this kind of spooky action at a distance is the term given for it. So I'm making a measurement here. There isn't time for light to propagate yet. I know what's going on over here. And so, Einstein said, we don't have this spooky action at a distance. Had this idea that, well, maybe there are some hidden variables that we can't measure, but that are actually core or determining what's going on. And, people thought, okay, that's an interesting idea, but there's no way to test it because these hidden variables are by definition unmeasurable. But in the 60s and 70s, people were able to do some work, particularly a guy named Bell was able to do some calculations and show that when you're working with these entangled systems, if there are hidden variables, there's a limit to how large certain quantities could be. And so if there are hidden variables, these measurements will always be below a certain level, but quantum mechanically, you could exceed that value. And so people have been working to test this idea, do we violate these inequalities, these Bell's inequalities? Because if we did, that would say, okay, we're fundamentally a quantum world. Well, the Nobel Prize was given for a series of experiments where they were able to measure these outcomes and show that, lo and behold, they exceed the threshold for a classical world, so that we really do live in a quantum world. If you kind of bring up the diagram there. So what you can do is in that middle there, that's just a way of saying, okay, we're making some entangled photons, and then we direct the photon, the photons are moving away from this source, and then you pass it through these polarizers, and for certain angles of the polarizers, you expect the quantum mechanical outcomes to be very different from the hidden variables outputs. And so people were able to make these measurements and show that at these things you exceeded these inequalities. It says there's quantum mechanics is the best description rather than the classical hidden variables description. But there are some loopholes in this, because it could be that in the process of entangling, you've done things where you've actually carried information away that even though later you're doing something, there could be correlations you just weren't aware of. And so there were more experiments done where not only have you now entangled things, you've put this other piece in the experiment that randomly changes the polarization of the detectors. And you can trigger that off of cosmic rays coming in or random processes. And so it removes any of the loopholes that say, okay, there's actually some piece of information we're not measuring or some correlation. We're actually finding that these Bell's inequality theorems are violated, that we do live in a quantum world. And what that means, so this is kind of the bottom line apologetics of it. One, they got the Nobel Prize. This is just cool, fascinating work. But it really just shows us what a bizarre world we live in. What this means is that we have this intuitive idea that, two intuitive ideas. One is that what influences me can only be things that have been within, where light can travel from there to here. That's called localism. So that's one fundamental idea that we have. The other idea we have is that there's this idea that things are real, and these are a little bit more philosophically, they're more sophisticated than what I'm saying, but the idea that only things within my light cone can influence me, but also that things are there whether I've measured them or not. And that's called realism. And what these violations of Bell's theorem say is that you can't have a universe that is both local and real. And so where that plays out when you're doing these quantum entanglement events, you can spread them out far enough apart, make a measurement here, make a measurement here, and you find that they're correlated even though there's no ways for photons to communicate between them. And so you've got this choice. Do you get rid of localism, or is localism wrong, or is realism wrong? Now, I'm inclined to think things being local are wrong, that things are there whether you measure them or not. But it does just kind of get at the nature of reality. If you kind of, the next slide there, you can go out and look at the wiki page, and there's this interpretations of quantum mechanics. And why I bring this up is because when Einstein proposed his theory of general relativity, it explains why gravity works. Gravity works because of the warping of the fabric of space-time. The mechanism determines what we measure, and so you make calculations, and nobody has their interpretation of general relativity. General relativity, the reality determines the equations and the measurements you make. But you look at quantum mechanics, and you got the ensemble, the Copenhagen interpretation. That's where the wave function collapses into one state or the other. You've got the many worlds interpretation, where both exist, and the electron takes all pass. I mean, you've got all these weird interpretations of what the fundamental nature of reality is, where you don't have that in general relativity. And it just highlights that we are lacking a genuine fundamental understanding of how the world works. And where I think this has apologetic interest, and I don't want to push this too hard, but I think it's an interesting idea, that we think that we've got, write down the equations, we can predict everything exactly as they're going to happen. It seems like God has structured this world so that, yes, there is this orderly, reliable regularity to nature, but there's also these non-intuitive, where things that are much further away from me can impact what's going on with me. And, just as a Christian, I know that I am convinced that God communicates with me through prayer. Well, if everything is local and real, I don't necessarily see how that could play out with God, apart from God just changing the physics of the universe when he wants to communicate with me. But if there's this kind of underlying fuzziness to the reality of nature, God can now communicate. I mean, it worked very easily. Or the idea that quantum mechanics behaves that way makes it far more reasonable to think that God might be doing something similar to that. And so I think it just gets at, we have a lot to understand about how our world works, and we need to not be quite so smug of, we've got all the things worked out, we're going to wrap everything up, explain everything, and it's just going to be in this nice tight ball.
Yeah, well, I mean, you make an interesting point about the idea that maybe one means by which God affects the world, particularly through prayer, or affects us maybe through, again, quantum indeterminacy and this idea of quantum entanglement. And, I've seen some people who have argued, well, God is creating through an evolutionary process, and that he's actively involved in every instant of that evolutionary history of life on Earth. It's just invisible to us because God's influencing the outcome of evolution at the level of quantum indeterminacies.
Right.
And I've always been a bit uncomfortable with that. Not that I don't think it's a possibility, but I've always been a bit uncomfortable with that simply because it seems to me that if God is working as creator, what I read in Scripture, that it would be clearly revealed to me. So I don't have a problem with using that mechanism maybe to explain prayer or the way that God may interact with us, but it seems like I'm uncomfortable with that notion as God employing that mechanism as creator. So how would you respond? Not looking for agreement or disagreement.
No, that's actually. It seems to me there's two fundamentally different things we're talking about there. One is God's revealed in Scripture that, hey, he's done certain things. I would expect to find the signature of that written in creation. And if God is working behind the scenes, it's all just, the laws of physics are not God not working. But if that's what it is, it seems like that signature is harder to read, and it seems like God has put that signature there. I guess where I'm thinking this is relevant is less about how do we explain things, God's activity, where we don't, in a way that we don't see, as it is this idea that God knowing everything predetermines everything, or that there are things that appear to be fundamental to our universe but aren't. I know, talking enough with Ken Samples, that God is timeless. Well, I mean, time seems to be just a fundamental quantity, and if in this world, time is unavoidable. It's a fundamental part of who we are. But it's not, if I understand what theologians have said, it's not a fundamental, this is the determinant of all existence. It's a restriction of, it's something that exists in our universe here that we experience. But it's not something I have to talk about with God, or that God necessarily has to have time. And so this thing that I see as fundamental is actually a constraint that God has put on the world, not a fundamental aspect of reality. And I see that kind of at play here. And how could God know everything and yet we still have choice? Well, if everything's local and real and you're right, those are incompatible, but this is kind of pointing to something beyond, or rather, we see evidence that we don't live in a local, real world, where you now have these things that can not violate the laws of physics, but where you can get information transmitted faster than the speed of light. Let's not be so arrogant as to say, we've got everything mapped out and there's no way that God's foreknowledge and you and I having a genuine choice is incompatible with one another. Right. I think that's really where I'm going, not we now have this means where God can set up the laws of physics and everything works, except God's got this tool to work behind the scenes, if you will.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. That's a very helpful distinction, I think, a very helpful clarification.
But I'm just curious, how do you see that? Because this idea that we have to give up only things local to me can influence me, or that things aren't there if I'm not observing them. We have to give one of those up. That's just kind of like mind-blowing, if you will.
Yeah. I'm not sure how I would react to that. I've taken enough quantum mechanics as a graduate student to keep my mouth shut when it comes to discussions on quantum mechanics. And it always amuses me that there are people that are speaking about quantum mechanic effects that shouldn't be talking about it at all. Not you, but
I notice I'm very measured in what I'm saying, just for that reason.
Yeah, but one of the things when I was a grad student, really working and learning the basics of quantum mechanics, and I did take I took 3 or 4 graduate level courses in quantum chemistry, and so I'm far from an expert, but I know enough to dig myself a deep hole. The big struggle I had was not being able to picture what was going on.
Yeah.
And then I had that epiphany one day where it's like, give that up. Don't worry if you can picture it or if it makes sense. Just this is the way the quantum world works, and just treat it as a world that has a different set of rules than what I'm accustomed to. And then once I did that, I was very comfortable working in quantum mechanics, but it took that. So I think that's to your point. Like we want to hold on to this idea that maybe, that there is this, we live in this local universe or the universe characterized by localism. And that's a convenient way to think about it because maybe we can picture things, but we actually give up on what constitutes reality. And I think you make a really powerful point that, when you start thinking about the world being a quantum mechanical world, it opens up all kinds of possibilities for things being possible that I think someone from a strict materialistic perspective may preclude, where a person of faith may be far more open to it.
Your comment about your recognition that you need to just kind of quit trying to understand and just this is the way it works and do it and it works. That actually seems to me kind of a parallel way of how I think about Christianity, if you will. That not that it can't be understood. There's places where you have, okay, I get a little bit of what's going on with quantum mechanics. But if what Scripture says is true, this world is not the ultimate reality. And so we're wondering, how can God be everywhere at the same time, but yet not seen? How can God know or foreknow everything, but yet we have free will? These are questions that have plagued humanity for millennia. I wonder if there's not just a sense of, okay, God says this is the way it is. Let's live that way, and it works, if you will. Mm-hmm. Not that we don't keep trying to probe and understand, but don't let our lack of understanding negate the fact that that's the way it is, and just embrace what God has said and live that way, because there's a very real sense where when you do that, it works.
Yeah. Well, our colleague Hugh Ross makes this argument that I think is really interesting, and that is that one reason he is convinced that Christianity is true is that there are ideas in Christian theology, ideas in Scripture, but then in Christian theology, that if you and I were making up a religion, in our wildest dreams would never come up with those concepts.
Right.
Right. And so, when you look at, according to Hugh, other religions, you see religions that seem to be anchored in what we could understand or what makes sense to us. And so it's an interesting argument that, just the sometimes the bizarre nature of Christian theology, bizarre in the sense that it's so unfamiliar to our experience, and it leads to these questions that seem to be where there seems to be these contradictions when in fact they very well may not be, if we think about maybe reality as being something very different than what we experience in our own limited finite capacity.
Yeah, no, I agree. We live in a bizarre world, not bizarre as in, bizarre as in we couldn't even begin to dream this up if we were coming up with it based on what we know. So.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my discovery. And I don't know, you're a little bit younger than me.
No, we watched the A-Team growing up. I love that show. Always blowing something up, and you love it when a plan comes together. So.
Oh, great, Jeff! You're setting me up beautifully. Well, that I was an undergraduate student in the '80s, and then became a graduate student, and so I didn't have a lot of time to watch TV. So I didn't actually watch the A-Team, but if I had the time to watch TV, I definitely would have watched the A-Team. And I think it was like these guys that were former special force operatives that were accused of something they didn't do and were court-martialed and in prison and escaped and trying to clear their name. Right. So, and of course,
just going out and trying to help people who are otherwise in a bad way.
Right. Soldiers of fortune. And this was such a pop culture phenomena in its day that even though I didn't watch it, I knew who all the characters were. I knew their signature lines, just being immersed in the culture.
Oh, that's funny.
And you just said it, John Hannibal Smith.
Right.
His signature line was, "I love it when a plan comes together," chomping down on the cigar. Well, and it's funny because that line has had such a lasting effect that I hear people say it today.
Oh, really? Okay.
That are much younger than me, and it's like, I know that you probably never watched the A-Team,
right?
Let alone even know what the A-Team is. So it's interesting that line from a TV series actually has become kind of part of our vernacular,
right?
But there's there's something very gratifying when a plan comes together. Not that that's happened that much for me, but when it does, it's very gratifying. But there was a recent series of discoveries where people are looking at the question, what makes us unique as human beings? That makes it seem as if, when human beings appeared on the scene, that there was some kind of plan that came together just the way that it should. And it all has to do with, understanding the genetic differences between humans and Neanderthals, and understanding even more fully what the physiological effects of those genetic differences are. And the paper I want to talk about was published recently in Science by a team from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany. And they were, again, looking at a single genetic difference between humans and Neanderthals that seems to have profound consequences, physiologically speaking. And this work is really being done in the context of a larger set of questions that physical anthropologists have, which is, how do we understand our origin as modern humans? And then, are we unique as modern humans, or are we just simply more of the same compared to the other hominins? And if we are unique, what makes us unique? And is what makes us unique maybe explain why we are the sole, Homo species alive today?
Okay.
Does it explain why, for example, Neanderthals and the Denisovans went extinct? And so these are the questions that really are the focus of much of the work in physical anthropology. And again, that those questions center on who were Neanderthals and how do we compare to Neanderthals in terms of our cognitive abilities and behavioral characteristics.
Is this difference a genetic difference, physiological difference, both?
Right. It's genetic differences that then translate into physiological effects.
Okay.
You could have genetic differences that have no physiological impact.
So, so I guess that leads to the follow-up question I had is it a single genetic difference that all humans are one and all Neanderthals are other, or because I think there are some differences where there's the population of the two overlap, but there's distinct populations.
No, these are what I'm going to be talking about are genetic differences that create a version of a gene that is unique to modern humans and distinct from Neanderthals and the Denisovans, as well as the other primates, the great apes, old world monkeys, and even other mammals.
Gotcha.
But when it comes to probing these questions in in physical anthropology, traditionally people have studied, the anatomical features of fossils, have looked at the archaeological record, and have tried to extract that understanding. And, in the last couple of decades, there's a whole new approach that's emerged based on our ability to isolate DNA fragments from fossil remains. And through these isolation and sequencing of these fragments, we now have high-quality genomes for Neanderthals and Denisovans. In fact, multiple Neanderthal high-quality genomes that are available to us. And this
that's just as impressive as all get out that we can do something like that.
In fact, it's so impressive that the Nobel Prize in 2022 was awarded to Svante Pääbo, who is the pioneer.
I just want you to know I did not coordinate that with you, that we're both talking about Nobel Prizes from this year.
Yeah, we didn't, but it worked out. Because this has literally revolutionized how we understand the hominins and really how they compare to us. Mm-hmm. Because now that you have these genomes available, you can now do comparisons between Neanderthals and Denisovans and modern humans and the great apes, and and the list goes on and on. And doing these comparisons, there's the Neanderthal and the human genome are about 98 to 99% similar. It's highly similar genomes, but there are some differences, and people have focused on the differences in the protein coding regions and have cataloged about 96 differences, where there are 96 genes in the human genome that are shared in the Neanderthal genome, where the gene sequence is different, and that difference translates into the production of proteins that differ by a single amino acid. Okay. So that's and there's about 20,000 genes approximately in the human genome. So it's a relatively small fraction where you do see a genetic difference, and the question becomes, well, is this genetic difference significant? Mm-hmm. And so initially people would just catalog these differences and look at the functions of the genes. And some of the genes where we see differences are genes that are involved in neural development, genes that have been implicated in neuropsychiatric disorders. Also, some of the genes are involved in skull and facial development. other aspects of skeletal developments, and that actually can explain why we see some anatomical differences between humans and Neanderthals. People have even been able to infer gene expression patterns for those genes and have seen differences in these genes, which are all suggestive that there are physiological consequences to these differences, and that these physiological consequences may actually impact cognition, indicating that maybe modern humans had a greater level of cognitive capacity than Neanderthals.
Okay.
And so one of these genes that had just been studied in this paper is a gene that's nicknamed TKLT-1 protein. And this
you guys as biochemists are even less creative and original than astronomers are in their names.
Well, true, guilty as charged. But this stands for the transketolase-like transferase 1 protein. And it's a protein that was discovered to behave like a class of enzymes called transketolases, and it turns out that this actually behaves so much like transketolases that it actually is a transketolase. But the name still sticks. But this class of enzymes plays an important role in a metabolic pathway called the pentose shunt, or the pentose phosphate pathways. And this is kind of an overview of intermediary metabolism, at least a couple of pathways. And the pathway on the left, in the light blue, the kind of elongated oval, is the glycolytic pathway. And this is a pathway where glucose, as a fuel source, is broken down into two 3-carbon compounds called pyruvate. So one glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule, gets broken down into 2 pyruvates, and then they get funneled into something called the Krebs cycle.
Okay.
And the net effect is that they are further broken down into CO2 and water. And the energy that's liberated by breaking those chemical bonds is trapped in molecules like ATP or NADH. And this is used to power different cellular processes. But there are intermediates in that pathway that can get funneled off into another pathway called, again, the pentose shunt, because it's kind of a shunt off of the glycolytic pathway. Sometimes it's called the pentose phosphate pathway. And what ends up happening is that you have these intermediates that are pulled off that then start swapping carbon units back and forth with one another. And through that swapping process, which is mediated by 2 types of enzymes, transketolases and transaldylases, you wind up with a large pool of different types of sugars, 3-carbon, 4-carbon, 5-carbon, 6-carbon sugars. And so a lot of the sugars, like the ribose and the deoxyribose that are used for RNA and DNA respectively, are produced in this pentose shunt, as are other sugars that have structural roles inside the cell, and also is a pathway in which you can introduce sugars that wouldn't go into the glycolytic pathway that can be generated into forms that would be plugged into the glycolytic pathway, allowing the means to break down other sugars. So it's a very important pathway.
So you got this process by which you get sugar into the body, and it now converts it into usable energy effectively.
Right.
But it's not just this single pathway. There's pathway, along with the main pathway of making energy-intensive molecules or energy-useful molecules, you've got other things that make stuff that life requires, like the ribose sugars, and presumably collecting stuff that you can use other places and re-injecting it back into the stream. So it's just a very a sophisticated sugar processing network.
Right. Now here's this is the details of what's going on there. And if you look closely, you can see a couple of places where transketolase is listed in the blocks. It's probably hard for people at home. But in other words, this is an integral component of this the carbon shuffling reactions of the pentose shunt.
So these transketolases and other things are what facilitate these other side reactions from or being able to happen and process. Okay.
Right. Yes. And so then what we also see is that there's an interconnectivity between the pentose phosphate pathway and the means by which you would make fatty acids. And so the end product of the pentose shunt can be fed into the fatty acid synthetic pathway. Also, one of the products that's produced in this pathway is a compound called NADPH, which serves as an energy source that also drives fatty acid synthesis. So transketolase is not only mediating locally the pathways in the pentose shunt, but its activity is impacting other pathways as well. So when you
why do you want the fatty acids? That's unclear. Oh, you're going to get to that. Okay.
Yes. And it's because people have discovered, and they don't understand why, but when you ramp up fatty acid synthesis, it actually ramps up the rate at which neural stem cells undergo replication or
interesting.
Right. And so people believe that fatty acid synthesis is a critical aspect of what's going on in neural stem cells, neural progenitor cells, so that during the developing neocortex, you have a high level of fatty acid synthesis, which supports the production of neural cells from these neural stem cells and neural progenitor cells, allowing for the neocortex to develop.
So presumably having less production of these, I don't even remember the terms, the TKL,
right?
More of that will facilitate larger brain activity or more brain material. Less of that will have. Okay.
So as the activity of the transketolase increases, you're going to wind up with an increase in the in fatty acid synthesis.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because you're making more of those materials available for the fatty acid synthetic pathways to make use of. And that impacts basically neural development. So all that, to kind of lay the groundwork.
Okay, so we've got this genetic difference between humans and Neanderthals that plays into this sugar pathway that facilitates the development of fatty acids, which develop brain activity or brain capacity. Okay.
So this transketolase, like transferase 1 protein, the version in modern humans is different than the version in Neanderthals, Denisovans, primates, and even in mice and other mammals. And all of those organisms have the same version of the transketolase enzyme. In modern humans, it's a unique version. But what makes it unique is a single amino acid difference. In humans, I think it's an arginine has replaced the lysine. And so the question is that even significant, right? So, you could argue by implication, well, this might very well mean that, there's a cognitive difference between humans and Neanderthals because this impacts basically neural development. But, you don't have the direct experimental evidence for that. And in the last couple of years, this group at the Max Planck Institute primarily has pioneered an approach to experimentally evaluate these differences. And there are two tools that they're using. One is CRISPR gene editing, where you could go into the genome of a model organism and replace that organism's gene with the human version of the gene or with the Neanderthal version of the gene. And you can then look to see what impact does that have on that model organism. Another tool that's available is to actually grow what are called brain organoids. These are three-dimensional cell cultures. Depending on the culture conditions, you get them to form like these little mini brain-like structures. And depending on the growth conditions, these brain organoids can mimic different regions of the brain. And the longer they grow, the greater the proliferation in the number of cells, the different cell types, and even you start seeing structural differences within the interior of the brain organoid. So by combining these two methods, you can, for example, replace a mouse version of a gene with a human version and look at what effect does it have on the mouse as it grows and develops. Or you can use the stem cells that you would use to create these brain organoids and modify them with the Neanderthal version. and begin to look experimentally at what are the effects. And
so these experiments allow us to, instead of just saying, okay, we've got this genetic difference between humans and Neanderthals, that we can make an inference that might be responsible for the brain difference. We're now going to say, do we see things that actually validate that hypothesis?
Right. So, I mean, in this particular paper, these researchers did really three main experiments. One was to take mice as a model system, and they replaced the mouse version of the transketolase-like transfer 1 protein with the human version. And then they did another experiment where they replaced it with the Neanderthal version. Right. Now, mice don't normally express that particular enzyme in their developing neocortex. And their neocortex is small and it's relatively smooth. There's a limited number of folds. And so what they noted is that when they used the human version of this, that a particular stem cell called a basal radial glial cell actually proliferated at very high levels, much more so than in the wild type.
Okay.
Now, this is significant because this particular cell is a type of stem cell. It's a progenitor cell, but it undergoes what's called asymmetric cell division, where when it divides, it produces a daughter cell that is a basal radial glial cell, and then another daughter cell that is fated to develop into a neuron.
Okay.
And so so in other words, it allows for a self-amplification effect to go on, where by having a large number of these cells that are undergoing cell division, you can actually create a larger number of neurons with this particular progenitor cell. And so they noted that the number of these cells proliferated, again, at a much higher level in the mouse brain than in the wild type.
So introducing the human variant caused the replication of cells that produce more neurons.
Right. You didn't see that effect when the Neanderthal version was introduced and was coaxed to be expressed.
Right.
So then they did another experiment.
Did they have to coax the human one to express?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so both places
because it doesn't
it.
naturally express. Okay. So then in the next experiment, they used a ferret as a model. Now, the reason why they chose a ferret is because the neocortex is larger and it has folds in it similar to our neocortex. And the transketolase 1 or the transketolase enzyme is expressed in the ferret brain. So when they put the human version in, again, they saw a proliferation in the number of the basal radial glial cells compared to the wild type, and they saw that the folds in the brain were much more pronounced. So this is obviously having an impact. Again, no effect seen with the Neanderthal version. And then the last experiment was...
So the folds presumably have something related to what's different in the human brain than the Neanderthal
Right, because
brain.
when you have the folds, you're creating a greater amount of surface area per volume.
Gotcha.
Right. So and the folds correlate with an enhanced cognition.
Gotcha.
Then the last experiment that they did was taking induced pluripotent stem cells that they would use to grow a human brain organoid, and they Neanderthalized it. And when they Neanderthalized that, they ended up seeing that the basal radial glial cells actually diminished in number compared to what you would typically see in the brains, grown with obviously the modern human version of the gene. And so when they put all this together, what they think is going on is that even though the brains of Neanderthals were the same size as our brains, they believe that the neuronal density in our brains, in the modern human brains, was much greater than in Neanderthal brains. And so this is kind of summarizing this. So when you have the Neanderthal version of the TKTL1 gene, the basal radial glial cells will produce neurons, but in the human version, you see, again, a proliferation of the basal radial glial cells that lead to an enhanced number of neurons. And so this would correlate with, again, this idea of humans having advanced cognition. Now, this study is one of 3 other studies that I'm familiar with where similar types of experiments were done. There was a study I talked about on the very first episode of Star Cells and God, involving a protein called Nova-1, where there's a modern human version and then a Neanderthal Denisovan version that are different by a single amino acid. And the Nova-1 that you see in Neanderthals is also what you see in primates as well.
Right.
And when they grew cell cultures, the human brain organoids, and compared that with the Neanderthalized ones, where they replaced the human Nova-1 with a Neanderthal Nova-1, they ended up seeing architectural differences in the brain organoids, and they actually saw a greater level of cell proliferation in the human version than in the Neanderthal version, and saw differences in gene expression patterns.
Right.
For adenylyl succinate lyase, this is an enzyme involved in purine metabolism. There's a difference between the human version and the Neanderthal version. Again, single amino acid. This that difference has metabolic implications that's been experimentally determined. Turns out that gene actually or mutations in that gene actually lead to neurodegenerative type diseases or neural diseases. And then we also talked about these 3 proteins that are involved in ensuring integrity during cell division.
Okay.
And that there's modern human versions of these 3 proteins that are different than the Neanderthal and the Denisovan versions. And in those instances, again, you wind up with not only having you wind up having human brains where the neurons that result are actually higher quality neurons. They're not subject to what's called chromosomal segregation errors. So in other words, what we're seeing is, through a series of studies that have been published in the last couple of years, is this growing evidence that there is a difference in the brain physiology of modern humans compared to Neanderthals, all of which support the idea that humans had advanced cognitive capacities compared to Neanderthals.
Right.
And so this allows us to make a scientific case for human exceptionalism, and that humans are cognitively superior to Neanderthals. And that, if anything that we do to make a case for human exceptionalism, I think allows us to connect that to the idea that we see in Scripture that humans are made in God's image. And in fact, I would argue that the way in which we are considered to be exceptional by people that hold to that view would align with, I think, what we would consider to be qualities that reflect the Imago Dei, namely our capacity for symbolism and things like that. But at minimum, it means that there is a case that could be made for human exceptionalism and advanced human cognition. And again, that could be marshaled in support of making a case for the type of human exceptionalism we see described in Scripture, in the fact that we bear God's image. What it also means is that when we look at the archaeological record, there is a fierce debate among physical anthropologists as to whether or not Neanderthals had the same capacity for symbolism as we did as modern humans. And for every claim that Neanderthals were engaged in symbolic behavior, there are counter studies that suggest otherwise. So it's a raging debate where the evidence, or at least the interpretation of the evidence, is not clear cut. I think that these studies allow us to view the archaeological record through the lens of brain physiology now. In that when we look at claims about Neanderthals engaged in symbolism, we should take those claims with a grain of salt, because the data is indicating, physiologically speaking, Neanderthals probably didn't have the cognitive abilities to do the things that people are claiming that they did from speculative interpretations of the archaeological record.
So this kind of tips the balance. You could make argument from just the physical data of the archaeological record, but this tips it in the balance of saying, no, they probably don't have that.
Right. Because when you're interpreting the archaeological record, you're inferring behavior and then inferring cognitive capacities from again, artifacts that are there. Plus, on top of that, you're having to establish a correlation between the fossil record and the archaeological record. So a lot of times you don't actually have any kind of fossil evidence to substantiate that those artifacts were actually produced by Neanderthals or by modern humans. So you're relying on correlations. So there's a lot of reasons to think that, well, there's a lot of reasons why it's very difficult to properly interpret the archaeological record. So having, this insight into brain physiology really goes a long way towards ensuring that we are making a proper interpretation of the archaeological record.
One question. So, you've listed 3 or 4 there, but if you just take the TKLT1 genetic difference there, that sounds like that's one amino acid. That's, one mutation in the genetic code, and you get this remarkably different behavior. Now, you might say, okay, there's 3 or 4 that have to happen kind of in concert, or that have all worked roughly at the same time period. Wouldn't that lend support to a evolutionary way of looking at things? Because that's kind of a relatively minor change to get a very marked difference. Or how would you respond to that claim that this lends more support to an evolutionary rather than a creation?
I would actually say the opposite.
Because?
For 2 reasons. One is the Neanderthal version of these genes is the same in primates, the great apes, old world monkeys. We see in many instances the same gene in the mouse genome. And for a biologist, what that means is that particular gene must be so critical to the organism's survivability that mutational changes are being weeded out by natural selection.
Okay, so the mechanism of evolution would say, given the uniformity of how much it shows up, even one change is probably going to get weeded out.
Right. So one way you determine functionality in the critical functional role for a particular gene sequence or for a particular amino acid in a protein is by comparing it to other organisms.
Okay.
If it's the same, you consider it to be, again, critical function.
So, my initial response to that would be, I see it is pretty critical, and there's lots of ways where it can go wrong. But the fact that you can change it, I could imagine a whole slew of things that did get weeded out, but you got this one. It's like, oh, wow, you got this dramatic change. And so.
Well, to me, what becomes suspicious is that you have this, it's not a single amino acid change in a single protein that has a positive effect. But it's a single amino acid change in a suite of proteins that are having an effect. And all of those effects are working towards enhanced cognition in humans. It starts to become highly suspicious. And this list is, in my opinion, probably the tip of the iceberg, that there's going to be other discoveries of differences that also are meaningful, particularly with respect to supporting advanced cognition.
So in an evolutionary scenario, you might expect that you get the TKLT somewhere, but it wouldn't show up. The NOVA would be in the same one. If that works that way, you'd see a smattering of those rather than all of them concentrated in one organism.
This really eerie confluence of mutations that are all working together to increase, advanced cognition. And so, in other words, it looks like a plan came together. Right?
All right, I'll give you that one.
So it's to me you're right. If it's just an isolated instance, or if it's happening in several genes but they're not really working in concert with each other, I might buy it. But the fact that it's again having this directional effect, right? So that means that even if you're viewing the origin of humanity in evolutionary terms, this would be, I think, evidence for a type of theistic evolution. Or if you're looking at the origin of humanity from a creationist perspective, you would say, well, it really looks like a creator intervened to create this distinct set of genes that are unique to humans to give us advanced, cognition and to make us exceptional in a way that aligns with the image of God.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. It's just initially when you say, hey, it's a single a single mutation, it's easy to get a single mutation and work. But the the fact that you have multiple ones of these in the same organism that all work together to do so. That does. I'm with Hannibal there. That seems like a plan's coming together. So.
All right. Well, anything else, Jeff?
No, I'm done.
I think I'm done. So we'll go ahead and bring it to a close. And just want to say thank you so much for watching. We would invite you to interact with the content of this video in the comment section. And again, remember to check out our website, reasons.org. Follow us on social media, RTB_official. And also, again, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1. Set a reminder so you get notified when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops. And until then, next time, remember that the more that we discover about science, the more we have reasons to believe.